My question that I'm going to be talking about today is there a difference between women and men and the punishments that they receive when they have inappropriate relations with students? This is just mainly talking about teachers and what inappropriate relationships they may have with their students, and whether or not like women or men are more likely to be put in jail, or if one of them is more likely to be held on a higher bond than the other, and just things like that. And the reason why I chose this topic is because I actually had a teacher in high school who it was rumored at first that he had been dating or sleeping with one of his students. And this teacher was notoriously creepy. He used to make me hug him, and I know I wasn't the only one that had these issues with him, where he just was way too touchy with like students and stuff. And then about 2 years after this whole situation happened, the student that it was rumored about actually ended up coming out that she had been dating him, and they had been dating for 2 years at that point, because they dated after he got fired and continued to date after that. And just like, he was generally creepy with people. There's a lot more rumors that there was other girls involved with this, and not just like she was the only one he was dating, or he had those relationships with a few other students. And he was just generally a creepy person. And he met with like the seniors one year, or the year he got fired, and was like, here's my part of the story. And she was one of those seniors. And just, he was a shady person, and nothing ever went to the police, nothing. We found out about it we knew it was happening. The rumors were going around, but they were all screaming, oh, it's just rumors. And then about 2 years later, she comes out that it was true, and that everything everyone had been saying and thinking about was true. And so, yeah. So, what my question is all about is whether gender does have an effect on being convicted, or, even like with bail. Because, again, if they're put on bail, that means they possibly committed a crime and they are on bail before they go to trial. It also does raise a question, though, about if there's a difference between males and females that are being turned in. Because if they're not turned in and they're not brought to the police's attention, then that means that nothing will happen, essentially, unless like someone does turn them in. So I'm going to start with 2 stories about 2 female teachers, and I found these online, and I did this using a Google search, because I did start with a Google Scholars search, but that proved nothing. I found nothing. I found like a lot of random studies about like students and their sleep schedules and teachers with their sleep schedules, but nothing like, there's not, like, I could not find the evidence on it. And like what evidence I found and like what studies I found were done by like news sources, which those aren't scientists. Those are just people that can run a statistical test incorrectly, usually. So yeah, my first one is about Carly Green. She was a dance teacher in Pennsylvania, and she faced felony charges of statutory sexual assault and institutional sexual assault of a child. And she abused this child over 50 times. She had been teaching him as his teacher in dance since he was about 10 years old. Or over 10 years. It was over 10 years. And the mother found out because the kid started acting different. He started doing drugs. He started to have bad grades. He was depressed, and he started to abuse substances like drugs and alcohol. and that was abnormal for him. And then the bond, like her bond, was set at $50,000 for the abuse of a child over 50 times with 2 felony charges. The next one is about Catherine Hogtailing, and she pleaded no contest on 6 counts of third-degree criminal sexual conduct and 1 count of delivering a controlled substance to a child. And she got 4 to 15 years in prison. That is what she was actually sentenced with. And she did this to 2 different students. And in the actual article, this is one of the only ones I found that actually talks about, like, the effect this had on their children, and, like, just how, like, maybe traumatizing it was to them, and, like, just, like, generally, like, what damage was done to their children. So this is, like, the impact statements that would have been done at trial, and most likely were done at trial. They didn't explicitly state that they were the ones done at trial, but it wouldn't surprise me if that was not when they were said. One of the, like, parents, the mother, told the news place, or either did it in the impact statement, that her child became the punchline of a joke and went from confident to withdrawn and unconfident, and that it just really affected his mental stability and mental health, and just, like, it affected him in very negative ways. And then the next one was actually, this kid had lost his mother, like, a few months before the abuse started, and his great uncle was his legal guardian at this time. He had to switch school his senior year. So his senior year of high school, he switched schools completely because he was being bullied so bad for having a relationship with his teacher, even though it was the teacher's fault. But it's kids, they don't understand that. And then I had a lot of struggle finding 2 male teachers. A lot of the teachers I found were all female. So it became a, like, fight for me to try to have to find female teachers, or not female, male teachers instead of the female ones. I actually ended up talking to friends and family about, like, maybe teachers that they knew that were male that had done this, and the police had actually been involved with it. And my boyfriend gave me one, and his name is Troy Rush, a former ROTC teacher at Warren Central High School, and he got 3 years of probation for pleading guilty to 1 count of dissemination of matter harmful to minors. And he had a relationship with one of his students that they know of for sure that met regularly, and they met on school grounds regularly. They would have intercourse and, like, sexual contact in the ROTC supply closet is what they called it. So probably just, like, a closet in his, like, school classroom. And they even brought in, like, police officers for it, and they found, like, evidence of stuff, like, trying to think of a good way to say this. They found sperm and other substances by, like, on the floor and right around where the supply closet, like, inside of it. And he originally faced 11 charges of felony child seduction, but instead he took a plea deal, which is how he got down to 1 count of dissemination of matters harmful to minors. And they did interview 6 other girls about Rush and what he did to them, because it was reported that he did these things to other girls, not just the one girl who he met with regularly. But from what they found was only one of them did he meet with regularly, and she was the one that came forward, or someone came forward for her. She was a minor, so of course, like, they don't say her name. And then the next one I found, and this was a very short article, and, like, I looked up his name. I tried to find everything about him. I just know this was at a Christian academy. It was Brett Moore of California, and he's being held on a bond of $9.2 million. He faces multiple felony charges of child molestation, but I couldn't find any other information about this. I do know that, like, it's a Christian academy, but I am not sure whether it's the, like, little kids, like elementary, or if it's high school. They did not specify which like school he taught in and what ages he taught. So I could not find more information on him. I looked him up. He hasn't gone to trial as far as I know. And then I have two other sources. And these ones were news articles that were like, oh, I did this study in New Jersey was one of them. And just like, they try to bring in facts about things, but I don't feel like they were good. But they're what I could find for sources about this. And it says, this one was just a teacher that wrote this, and it's actually very troubling. Personally, reading it, I was sickened by it and just really scared for the world. But it starts out with saying that all teachers end up being attracted to their students. Just some don't act on it. And they pretty much just state that outside communication is typically what starts to make that relationship happen. Like just like getting in contact with your students on social media, or emailing, texting, calling, stuff like that is how these relationships may be starting and just like continuing. And they argue that women with young student relationships are just fetishized, which means to them that really they get off with it more than males do, and that men with girls are villainized. And they said that about 80 to 96% of teachers found guilty are males in New Jersey. But with that, female crimes were less atrocious than men. And so that means like the men that they studied were more likely to use threats. So like if you tell your parents, or if you get like the police involved, I will hurt you is typically what I'm thinking it was. Or if you get these people involved, I'll tell your parents is probably one that they try to use, like to just like scare the kids and keep them from like talking about like the relationship that they are forcing on these children. And then the next one was a Star Ledger investigation, and it found that males receive harsher punishment than females when it comes to sexual relationships with students. They think this is because girls are more protected in this society than males are. And so like you always hear about just like, son, when you get older, you're gonna have to protect your girlfriend, or you're gonna have to protect your sister and stuff like that. And they think that like their male counterparts are more so seen as just like, you'll be fine, or like, oh, you're just living out the fantasy. You got to live out the fantasy of like having sex with your teacher. And so it's like not taken as seriously for males compared to females. 54% of males went to prison against 44% of women in the study. And men had the longest sentence for men was 10 years, which is not long enough. And women was 7. And the one that was 7 was actually against a female teacher who had a relationship with one of her female students. And this was, and like these like statistics only look at what, like, they don't look at the charges. Like, they don't look to see like, oh, this person had 3 felonies counts of things, and like it didn't look at all about like any sort of like, I would say, mitigating factors that were in the cases, like doesn't bring in age or like how many times it's happened or just like really anything. It just looks at prison time and if they went to jail even at all. And I said, like, with the process of what I did, I originally tried Google Scholar and I came up empty most of the time. All the time with Google Scholar, I found no studies on it. I couldn't really find any information about it. So instead, I went to Google and I started to look up like teacher sleeping with student, or even just like sex with students, teachers relationship, sexual relationship with students. And I would just like sit there and go through them and just look at like what facts were presented in the like news articles that I read and whether I thought I would benefit from it. I had a lot more selection with the female ones though, because when I would look it up, all I found was females. Even like I would search like male teacher with student relationship, and I wasn't really finding anything. I had a really rough time just even like with that. It really just brought up females. It brought up like the Brett Moore one, which was the one that had like no information, and so I ended up like using that one because at that time that was the only one I could find. And I wasn't really sure like how I could change what I was like looking up, because I couldn't figure out like what the difference was, like why I was able to find the male, or why I wasn't able to find the male ones, but like the female ones were always coming up. And so it was something of like, I then had to go through and start asking people about like, did you have any teachers in high school or like when you're a kid that got charged for like relationships with students? And the only person I found that said like, yeah, they went to jail or like they had a trial for it was my boyfriend. And he has told me like what school he went to, and I looked it up, and we had to actually scroll through most of the page that popped up, because that teacher was not the first one that popped up. There was actually another teacher who was the softball coach, a female, that had inappropriate relations and was sentenced maybe. It may have been really recent because I didn't really click on it because I was looking for the male. But when I had to like scroll through most of the page, if not, I had to go to a second page of like Google searches to actually find the teacher that he was meaning. And we actually almost looked up like the high school and then sexual assault and then ROTC, because he was an ROTC teacher and that he knew that. But right before we did that, we found the article that said that was about him. And I decided to do this way instead of like trying to scour through and find scholarly articles about it, because this situation isn't scientific. There is nothing scientific about having a relationship with students. It's weird, it's gross, it's taboo, and there's not a lot of research on it. There's not a lot about why it happens, or even just things like that. So I figured I'd have to go with a more abstract way of like finding out information by like using Google, using the media and what's been put out by them, because that or I wouldn't really have information and it just shows like the real life experiences of it. It doesn't show hypotheticals. It shows just real life things that have happened to these kids and like the effects of it and like the punishments that they are actually receiving. Not like, oh, in Indiana the laws are this for this, especially because sex crimes are some of the most convoluted crimes. They have very interesting statutes and they have very interesting ways that they do things. It's just really hard to get information on this topic because it is so taboo. It is something that people just don't want to think about. Like, who wants to think about this? Because it's sad. It really is. Like, you don't want to think about kids dealing with abuse because this is abuse. It's sexual abuse. But like what I found again is I could find females, but I could not find males in the like searches, and when I did, there was very little information. And also I found that like even though males sometimes had longer sentences, like in the study it says that, but then the one teacher I found, he had 3 years probation, whereas the other teacher, and like he was supposed to be charged with more, but he got a plea deal so that he did not actually have to complete his like all those charges. He got a plea deal. He could go down, and he went down a lot. He went from possibly having to face, most likely having to face prison time, to not having to face prison time at all. And that was really weird because he had 11 counts of like he had felony charges, and those like charges were not like just something minimal. It's not something that like really should have just been like plead out, and like they were very obviously true, but he got to plead out and got to be only in jail for, or he wasn't even in jail, he got on probation for 3 years. And they don't actually mention in there whether he had to go on the sex registry. Most likely he had to. The sex offenders registry, most likely he had to. But one weird fact that I did actually notice with all of the articles, and it was which ones talked about impact. Typically, the ones that were about male teachers, they didn't talk about the impact. The one about Troy Rush had nothing about impact. It actually only talked about like, in the program he was called captain, and like the kids really liked him, and he was this good guy, and he was this good teacher, and everyone liked him. But like the female teachers, there was impact. Like it showed, like it talked about how much it happened. It talked about how it affected those students, and it talked about even just like the behaviors that led to the parents finding out about the abuse that that was happening on the children. Whereas like with Troy Rush, it did talk a little bit about how that girl, how the parents found out about her being I don't think it was even the parents. I think another student actually ended up telling about it. But that is actually like, it doesn't talk about her. It doesn't talk about what she'd been through, just that it had happened, and that there's a few other girls that they talked to about it. And at the very end, they put a little thing saying it was rumored that he would inappropriately touch and grope people, and he was just very inappropriate with them. But with the girls, there was always an impact, and like how it impacted the student that was dealing with it, and why it was bad. And like the one, it was like, this made my kid be bullied, and it doesn't, you don't really find out like if the females were bullied or if anything bad happened to them, because they don't talk about it. And just one of the takeaways that I had is that there is a lot more information that needs to be found out about this. This isn't well researched, and I'd argue that it does need to be researched a lot more. There is not comprehensive studies done. There's not scientific studies done. All the studies done were done by news places, and there is always a secret agenda with news places. They have audiences that they decide that they will cater to, and they have, they get money from people and things like that. But also, one of the things I want to know and I want to study of is how many of these cases actually go to the police. And I say that because I know the big one I know about never went to the police. I don't even think it ended up in the media. And the reason I thought it did is because when I was a kid, I swore that I had seen something in the news about it. I swore I had read an article about it, because even though I was there during it and I was like, oh yeah, I know about that, I'm there. I was certain that at some point there was a news article that had been written about it and that just talked about it generally, but I couldn't find a single one. I found absolutely none about it. I looked it up. I looked for it with like WCHS. I looked Whiteland Community High School, teacher fired, teacher resigned. I looked up anything that could have done with like choir teacher resigning, and I could find absolutely nothing on it. The only thing I actually found was one that was, it was weird because it wasn't like a teacher. It was someone that was like just kind of like connected to students. He would like work with show choirs. Like in the show band, he was a paid drummer. Like show choirs would pay him, and Whiteland had paid him at one point to work with us. It was actually one of the years I was in it, and he had gotten arrested for messing around with underage kids. But he wasn't a teacher. Or I think when all this was happening, he wasn't a teacher, so I didn't want to use him. And also, I could find very little information on him as well. And so it was kind of something I was like, I need information. And I think that the media is just very biased when it comes to things. I believe that the bias is very obvious because you can see that they talked more about why these experiences were bad for the males, but they didn't talk about why it was bad for the females. And even just like, they didn't talk about like why there's differences in like punishments. They didn't really like put in the mitigating circumstances. Really, like with the female teachers, they villainized them. To me, they were very obvious about like, this teacher is bad and this is the reason why I think this teacher is bad, and just like really just bagged on them. Whereas like the males, they're just like, he was a teacher here and this is like what he was called when he was here. The kids really liked him. It was just weird. And for me, like, this topic is kind of important because I am going to become a police officer. I will deal with students who have dealt with these situations. There is a possibility that these students may come into the police station and feel like they need help. And I want to know if there is a difference. Like, is a male student going to come into me and his, teacher is going to get off with it lightly? Or is this female student going to come into me and I know it's going to end up that male teacher is going to get out of it? Just because that is something important, and it's good to know the bias behind it and like be able to figure out like how you're going to have to get things done in a sense. Like, is it better for like the male students like to talk about like atrocities that happen to them, or is it better for like the females to really bring up like the impact? Because if like bringing in the impact is what's going to make them go to jail for longer, then that needs to be talked about. Like there needs to be the knowledge of like, how are we going to have to do this to get these kids justice. And I think like one thing that does, the reason why people make the argument against it, and like because what I found is that males got off better than the females did. But I think like the argument and where it comes from like the attractiveness bias theory. Like if a person is attractive, then they are more likely to get off and not have jail time, or like lower jail time than others. And just gender bias in criminal justice is always interesting to look at, and always a good thing to know about, because you never know. It's always weird to see like what it is, because like with males you would think the conventionally attractive guy, like the ones that are like more manly and stuff like that, would be the ones that would get off better just because they're conventionally attractive. But that's not it. They actually find men with baby faces are more likely to get off. And it's just like it helps with showing like an understanding with the attraction bias, and just really forces them to see what the difference is with it. Because there is a difference. There is very much a difference between what gender you are and what you're going to be charged with a relationship with a student. And I don't think there should be a big difference. I think it should always account for like what's happened to those students and what bad has happened to them, because we don't know all the specifics of the things. We just know what we're told, and the media does not say everything that happened. There could be situations that happen with the male teachers that weren't as bad as what happened with the female teachers. It did say with one of them that she abused this child over 50 times. But her bail was only set at $50,000, whereas like the one guy was at $9.2 thousand. I did find out that like from what I could tell, he worked there for a long time, so there's a possibility that this has been happening for such a long time that may be it. But I don't know, because it didn't tell me anything. So in the end, I just found that there needs to be a lot more research on this topic.